Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at something absolutely incredible. I want you to imagine a story written on clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. Literally, long before the Greeks were composing their famous epics, and honestly, long before the empires we usually think of as ancient even existed. Back then, the people of Mesopotamia recorded what might just be the ultimate story about the human fear of death. We are, of course, talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Okay, let's dive into this. In 1872, an ancient poem was actually making front-page news in the New York Times. Why? Well, because when fragments of this epic were finally translated, they completely shocked the modern world. They revealed a flood myth that was far older than the Bible, which, as you can imagine, sparked massive, lively debates everywhere. It was a complete paradigm shift in how we understand ancient history and human storytelling. But to really grasp why this was such a bombshell, we've got to look at how these stories were quite literally pulled from the dirt.
Section 1. Unearthing the First Epic.
You see, this is an archaeological mystery just as much as a literary one. These stories were lost for millennia, buried in the rubble of fallen empires, right in the ruins of Nineveh. To put the sheer scale of this into perspective, think about this number, 15,000. Back in the early 1850s, an explorer named Austen Henry Layard and his team dug up around 15,000 shattered fragments of Assyrian cuneiform tablets from the ancient library of Ashurbanipal. But here's the catch. Nobody could read them right away. It took decades of painstaking work by brilliant scholars like George Smith to piece those fragments back together and translate the cuneiform so the modern world could finally meet Gilgamesh.
The dizzying lifespan of this text really puts things into perspective. Its literary history actually kicks off around 2100 BCE with independent Sumerian poems about the king of Uruk. Then, hundreds of years later, around 1800 BCE, those standalone tales were woven together into what we call the Old Babylonian tablets. Fast forward a bit more to between 1300 and 1000 BCE, and an editor compiles the standard Babylonian version, creating a cohesive epic. After that, it was completely lost to time until the 1850s and finally translated in 1872, so we're talking about a story that had a 1,000-year evolution before it even spent 2 millennia buried in the sand.
Section 2. Tyrants, Wild Men, and Monsters.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core dynamic of the plot. If you strip away the ancient setting, the epic is basically the original mismatched buddy cop adventure. On one hand, we have Gilgamesh. He's the king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. But honestly, he's a terrible, oppressive, civilized tyrant who absolutely exhausts his people. So the gods hear the cries of the citizens and decide to create an equal to stop him. Enter Enkidu. He's a hairy wild man, created from dirt by the gods, and he lives out in the wilderness as a protector of beasts. It's the ultimate showdown, the civilized tyrant versus the creature of nature.
So how do these absolute opposites actually meet? Well, the gods orchestrate a plan to tame Enkidu. They send a temple prostitute named Shamhat out to him. After 6 days and 7 nights with her, Enkidu is civilized. His wild animal herd flees from him, and he learns human ways, like eating bread and drinking beer. Eventually, he hears about Gilgamesh's terrible behavior and gets enraged. He travels to Uruk, blocks Gilgamesh from entering a wedding chamber, and they get into a massive earth-shaking brawl. But here's the kicker. After this fierce test of strength, they recognize each other as equals, and they become the absolute best of friends.
Together, these two hit the road to seek fame, and their monster hunting resume is terrifying. First, they journey to the cedar forest to confront its monstrous guardian, Humbaba. With the help of 13 mighty winds sent by the sun god Shamash, they capture and slay Humbaba, along with his 7 sons. Later on, Gilgamesh essentially insults the goddess Ishtar, so she sends the massive bull of heaven down to destroy Uruk. And the devastation is epic. The bull literally opens up massive pits that swallow 300 men whole. But our heroes brutally defeat it anyway. It's an incredible display of strength, for sure, but also a showcase of their supreme hubris.
Section 3. The Quest for Eternal Life.
Now this is where the narrative tone completely pivots. All that monster hunting comes with a fatal cost, and it triggers a deep existential crisis. The gods decide that because they killed Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, one of our heroes has to die. They curse Enkidu with a fatal illness. And right before he dies, Enkidu has this ominous, terrifying dream where he sees the Mesopotamian afterlife known as the House of Dust. He describes it as a dark, bleak place where the dead eat clay and wear bird feathers. It's a grim, inescapable fate.
When Enkidu finally succumbs to the illness, Gilgamesh's reaction is just visceral and heartbreaking. The epic tells us that he clings to Enkidu's body and absolutely denies that his best friend has died. He flat out refuses to accept human mortality. He holds onto the corpse for days until, horrifyingly, a maggot drops from Enkidu's nose. It's only in that incredibly raw moment that the reality of death shatters Gilgamesh.
Consumed by grief, and now absolutely terrified of his own eventual death, Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom. He embarks on a desperate, perilous journey to the edge of the world. He strips off his royal robes, throws on lion skins, and wanders into the wild. He has to convince terrifying scorpion monsters at Mount Mashu just to let him pass. Then, he runs blindly through the sun god's tunnel for 12 double hours of pitch-black darkness to avoid being burned alive. Finally, he has to cut 120 punting poles to safely cross the deadly waters of death. And why is he doing all this? To find Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life by the gods.
When he finally tracks him down, Utnapishtim basically tells Gilgamesh that fighting the common fate of humans is totally futile. You see, the gods only gave Utnapishtim immortality because he survived a massive, world-ending flood by building a great boat. But he gives Gilgamesh a shot, a simple challenge. If he wants to conquer death, he must first conquer sleep. Just stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Well, Gilgamesh is exhausted from his epic journey, so he immediately passes out. Utnapishtim literally has his wife bake a loaf of bread every single day just to prove to Gilgamesh how long he's been sleeping. It's tragic, but also kind of hilarious.
Taking a bit of pity on him, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh a secret. There's a magical plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. So Gilgamesh ties heavy stones to his feet, dives all the way down to the sea floor, and actually retrieves it. But on the long journey back home to Uruk, he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water. And while his back is turned, a random snake slithers up, eats the magical plant, and immediately sheds its skin as it slithers away, totally rejuvenated. The bitter irony here is just crushing. Gilgamesh loses his one and only chance at physical youth to a random snake, leaving him sitting by the water, weeping at his own absolute futility.
Section 4. The Blueprint for Human Myth. Let's move to and see how this builds into something much bigger. Physical immortality might have slipped right through Gilgamesh's fingers, but the story he left behind achieved something far greater. Remember that New York Times quote from the beginning? Well, here is the controversy. When scholars analyzed Utnapishtim's flood story, they found undeniable, point-by-point parallels with the story of Noah's Ark in the biblical book of Genesis. Both heroes are warned by a deity, both build a massive boat sealed with pitch, both take animals and family aboard to survive, both release birds to find land, and both boats eventually come to rest on a mountain. To historians, it was a bombshell showing a clear shared Mesopotamian tradition of storytelling.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that the flood isn't the only parallel. Scholars have noted some seriously striking, eerie similarities between the story of Enkidu and the Garden of Eden. Think about it. Enkidu is created from the soil by a god, living naked and innocent in nature. Then, a woman introduces him to a new kind of knowledge through temptation. He accepts what she offers, closes nakedness, and forever loses his innocent connection to the natural world, which sounds an awful lot like Adam and Eve, right?
And the echoes literally don't stop there. Themes and direct elements from Gilgamesh ripple throughout all of world literature. The advice given to Gilgamesh to just enjoy the simple pleasures of life closely mirrors verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. Scholars see character parallels between Gilgamesh and Enkidu's rivalry and the story of Jacob and Esau. It's also widely believed that the epic's themes of powerful, grieving warriors and wondrous journeys were a direct thematic influence on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Even medieval legends of Alexander the Great's quest for the water of life trace their roots directly back to Gilgamesh. This ancient epic served as the literal blueprint for human storytelling.
So, what does this all mean for our hero in the end? Gilgamesh returns to Uruk completely empty-handed. But as he approaches the city, he looks up and marvels at the massive, magnificent brick walls he built. His epic journey concludes with him pointing out these walls, finally accepting his humanity. He realizes that while his physical body will eventually die, his tangible worldly creations, the civilization he built, protected, and nurtured, are his actual enduring legacy.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Utnapishtim told him, "Life which you look for, you will never find." And he was right, wasn't he? Gilgamesh the man did not live forever. But think about this.
By having his story pressed into clay tablets, buried under the sand, and eventually rediscovered to captivate us 4,000 years later, did Gilgamesh find immortality anyway? We are, after all, still talking about him today. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you in the next one.